Hold on tight, because the story you're about to hear is not for the faint of heart. Have you ever thought you truly knew someone, only to discover you've been sleeping next to the enemy? That's exactly what happened to Bryce Harrington. Picture this. Friday night on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Bryce, 37, built like a weapon in a three-piece black suit, was the kind of man whose name was whispered in fear across every dark corner of New York. On paper, a real estate mogul. In reality, the head of the Harrington empire. But for all his power, Bryce was blind in love with the wrong woman. He was walking toward his Rolls Royce, whistling, spinning his keys. His fiancée, Tanya, had asked him to grab champagne from the trunk for their engagement party. "Coming, babe," he murmured, thinking how perfect his life was. Poor fool. He had no idea his world was about to shatter. He popped the trunk and froze. The keys slipped from his fingers, clinking against the asphalt. His eyes that had stared down dangerous men without flinching went wide with pure shock. There, curled up like a wounded animal inside his trunk, was Melody, his housekeeper, 27 years old, her blue uniform torn and filthy, lip split open, a bruise darkening her cheek, and clutched against her trembling body, wrapped in old blankets, were two newborn babies, their tiny faces red from crying in silence. Melody looked up at him, not with relief, but with raw terror. "Please don't kill me, Mr. Harrington," she sobbed, pulling the babies tighter. "I swear, I didn't do anything wrong. Hit like if your heart's already racing. Share this with someone who needs a good story, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next." Bryce still stood there, his eyes locked on what lay inside the trunk, on a scene his mind couldn't make sense of. Melody, the gentlest housemaid in the entire estate, the one who'd never taken so much as a single cent, was now curled up inside his trunk with two newborn babies. He tried to speak, tried to ask something, but Melody spoke first, her voice trembling so hard each word seemed to shatter in midair. "Please, sir, don't let her see me. She'll kill everyone. She'll kill the babies, too." Bryce blinked. "Her? Who is she?" But the answer didn't come from Melody. It came from the sharp strike of high heels on the marble steps behind him. The front door of the mansion flew open, warm golden light spilling out like honey poured into the night, and a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. Tanya. She was wearing a blood-red dress, tight and expensive, down to every stitch, a diamond necklace at her throat glittering under the lights. But her face, the face Bryce had once believed was the most beautiful in the world, was twisted now with fury. "Bryce, what are you doing out there for so long? The guests are waiting. The wine's almost gone. Do you even know that?" Tanya stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes, a predator's eyes, swept the scene in a split second. The trunk open, Melody, two babies, and in 1,000th of a second, in a moment so brief almost no one would have noticed, Bryce saw it. Real panic flash in Tanya's gaze. But bad people moved fast. Bad people knew how to flip the board. Instead of fear, Tanya snapped her face into a theatrical mask of outrage. "Thief!" Tanya screamed, charging down the steps, her heels cracking like gunshots against stone. "I knew it. I knew I couldn't trust this girl. She kidnapped my niece and nephew." Bryce turned to Tanya, then back to Melody. Confusion crashed over him like a huge wave, drowning thought. Niece and nephew? Whose niece and nephew? You've never said you had little relatives in this house. From inside the trunk, Melody shook her head wildly, tears pouring down her face, her lips moving in frantic broken words. "She's lying, Mr. Bryce. She's lying. Look at the blanket. Look at the yellow blanket." But Tanya didn't give Melody a chance to say another word. She lunged for the trunk, grabbed Melody by the hair, and yanked her out with a brutal force so sharp Bryce heard strands tear free. Melody fell onto the driveway, her knees slamming into the asphalt, her elbows scraping raw, but her arms stayed locked around the babies, holding them to her chest as if her body was the last shield between them and the whole world. "Stop!" Bryce roared, one hand clamping onto Tanya's arm and hauling her back. His voice wasn't the voice of a happy fiancé anymore. It was the voice of Bryce Harrington, the man New York had to bow to. "There are children here. Have you lost your mind?" Tanya jerked away, eyes blazing, but she shifted tactics in the same breath. Her lips began to tremble, her eyes reddened, and with an astonishing performance, Tanya started to cry. "You don't understand. That girl took advantage of the party, all those people, to kidnap the babies. She has accomplices. I know she does. It's a whole ring. Right then, blue and red lights swept across the quiet street. Sirens tore the night open. 2 police cars screeched to a stop at the mansion gate. 4 officers jumping out, hands hovering near their weapons. Tanya had called ahead. She ran toward them, crying as she ran, both hands lifted as if she'd just escaped a disaster. Thank God you're here. That girl, she was trying to kidnap the babies. The officers looked at Tanya in her expensive dress, looked at the mansion blazing with light, then looked at Melody on the ground in a torn, dirty maid's uniform. And like every story of injustice in this world, appearances judged long before truth had the chance to speak. Let go of the babies. Put your hands on your head, one officer ordered, striding toward Melody with a cold face. No, Melody screamed, scooting backward on the ground until her back hit the tire. Don't give them to her. She'll hurt them. But no one listened. 2 officers hauled Melody up, wrenching the babies out of her arms. And in that moment when a tiny hand lifted, those little fingers reaching toward Melody, as she was dragged away, it was enough to break any heart clean in half. Tanya took the babies from the officers, but she held them the way someone held trash bags, keeping them away from her expensive red dress, her face twisting when one baby cried and smeared tears onto her shoulder. Bryce saw that. A small detail, but fatal. Someone who loved them would have pulled those babies close. Tanya was holding them like they were something dirty. The click of handcuffs sounded dry and hard. Cold metal tightened around Melody's thin wrists that had cleaned every corner of this house for 2 years and never once taken a cent. The police pushed her toward the car, and Melody knew this was her last chance. She twisted around, her face soaked with tears, and screamed with everything she had left. Mr. Bryce, the letter, Keith's letter. Find the letter in the blanket. The police car door slammed shut. Melody vanished behind dark glass. But that name Keith, rang out in the empty street like a bolt of lightning. Bryce stood in the road, his feet nailed to the asphalt. Keith, his younger brother. The brother who died a year ago in a car crash the police had ruled as having no criminal element. The brother whose photo Bryce still kept on his desk. Why would Melody mention Keith? Why would she have a letter from a man who was dead? And why? Why, when she heard that name, did Bryce see Tanya go pale for a single second before she forced it back under control? The police car had disappeared at the end of the street, the siren shrinking until it dissolved into the night, but Bryce still stood there in the dead quiet road, with the name Keith echoing in his head like a bell that wouldn't stop. Behind him, the mansion door opened again, and the familiar click of heels tapped along the steps. Bryce, come inside, Tanya called, her voice back to normal in a way that was terrifying, sweet and controlled, as if what had just happened were nothing more than an annoying fly that had been brushed away. The guests are waiting. Everyone keeps asking for you. Don't let that crazy maid ruin our night. Bryce didn't turn around. He stood perfectly still, spine straight, shoulders tight, like a statue holding a storm inside. Go in first, he said, his voice strangely flat, not a ripple of emotion. I need to check whether that girl took anything from the car. Tanya hesitated for a second, her eyes narrowing as if weighing something, but then she shrugged, turned on her heel, and disappeared back into the house, overflowing with music and laughter. The moment the door closed, Bryce spun and walked quickly to the Rolls-Royce. The trunk was still open, the dim light inside throwing pale shadows across the wrinkles of the old blankets Melody had used to wrap the babies. And there, in the deepest corner, where Melody had been curled up for hours, Bryce saw it. A yellow blanket, worn and frayed, and protruding from between its folds was the corner of a white envelope, crumpled, speckled with stains. Bryce took the envelope. His hand, the hand that had signed multi-million-dollar contracts without a tremor, the hand that had faced the most dangerous men in the city and stayed steady as stone, was shaking now, helplessly, because he recognized the handwriting on the envelope. The slanted, hurried script, the way the letter R always curved in that strange way. It was Keith's handwriting. On the front, in black ink, messy but unmistakably clear in every letter, it read, "To Bryce. If you're reading this letter, it means I'm no longer in this world." Bryce felt his knees go weak. He leaned against the side of the car, his fingers working the envelope open. The paper inside was slightly damp, maybe soaked with Melody's sweat during the long hours in the trunk, maybe soaked with her tears. He lifted it under the streetlight and began to read. Bryce, My brother. I'm sorry I've hidden too much from you. I have 2 children, 2 little angels, born from a love I had to keep secret because I was afraid. Their mother is an ordinary woman, kind, but she has no money, no power, and that makes her a target. Tanya found out about my relationship. She threatened that if I ever acknowledged my children, if I ever dared to claim my share of the inheritance, she would destroy everything. Brother, Bryce, I have to tell you the truth even though I'm afraid you won't believe me. The accident at the factory last month wasn't an accident. Tanya arranged it. She's obsessed with Harrington money, with your empire, and I'm an obstacle in her way. If anything happens to me, please, find my children. They carry our blood. They have Harrington eyes. Don't let Tanya get near them. She hates anything that could share even a single dollar of the fortune she thinks is hers. I trust you. You're the most honorable man I know. Your brother loves you, Keith. Bryce folded the paper back up, slowly, carefully, as if he folded it too hard, he would break apart with it. Then he dropped to his knees, right there in the middle of the road, on the cold asphalt, the knee of his designer trousers touching the ground, both hands gripping the letter, and a sound tore out of his chest, not a sob, but the sound of a man doing everything in his power not to scream into the night. Keith hadn't died in an accident. His brother had been murdered, and the person who'd killed him was inside that house, drinking champagne, laughing, wearing the engagement ring Bryce had placed on her finger with his own hand. Rage surged up like dynamite, scorching, roaring, rolling from his stomach to his chest to his throat. Bryce's fist clenched so hard his knuckles went white. He wanted to stand up right then, storm into that house, grab Tanya by the throat in front of 200 guests, and demand to know why she'd killed the only brother he had. But Bryce Harrington wasn't an ordinary man. He was the head of a shadow empire, and the first rule in his world was never to act while anger was in control. The man who let emotion lead would die first. He breathed in, slow, deep, breathed out, again, in, out, until the fire in his chest lowered, not extinguished, but forced down, compressed, transformed into something colder, sharper, more dangerous. Bryce stood up. He folded the letter and slipped it into the inner pocket of his vest, close to his chest, where his heart was beginning to beat slow and steady again. He adjusted his collar, smoothed his hair, and walked into the house with a face as blank as an iron mask. The party was still going. Soft jazz, glasses clinking, the scent of expensive perfume braided with grilled steak. Bryce took a drink from a server's tray, sipped once, and began to watch. He didn't have to wait long. Tanya was standing in the corner of the living room, her back to the crowd, one hand covering her mouth, the other holding her phone. Bryce moved quietly, using the music and laughter as cover, until he was behind a marble column, only a few steps away from her. Tanya's voice was low, urgent, razor cold. "Why are you so slow? The party's packed. This is the perfect time. The kids are in the kitchen with that old cook. You go in through the back door, take them. I'll pay double. But it has to be clean, Benny. You hear me? No traces." Bryce tightened his grip on the glass so hard he nearly crushed it. Benny the rat. A name Bryce knew well in the underworld. A man who did the dirty work nobody wanted to touch. Tanya went on, her voice so cold the air around her seemed to freeze. "Don't worry about anyone getting in the way. The old woman Harriet's locked up in a nursing home in Florida now. She doesn't know anything. Nobody can stop me." Bryce had heard enough. Every piece dropped into place. Melody hadn't lied. That small maid had overheard this exact phone call 6 hours earlier, while she was mopping near Tanya's office. She'd run to the guest house behind the garden, found the babies, wrapped them in blankets, tucked Keith's letter inside, and climbed into the Rolls-Royce trunk because it was the only escape she could think of. 3 hours in suffocating darkness, Whisper singing lullabies to 2 newborns, crying without sound, just to keep them alive, to keep them safe. Bryce stepped back, went into the guest bathroom, locked the door, and pulled out his phone. He dialed his attorney, Caldwell. The line rang once. "Yes, Mr. Harrington. Caldwell, listen. Bring the best private investigator you've got. Bring an emergency DNA testing kit. Come to my house right now. I don't care what time it is. This is life and death." "Understood, sir." 15 minutes. No question why. Not a second of hesitation. Because when Bryce Harrington gave an order at midnight in that voice, no one on earth asked for a reason. Bryce looked into the mirror, His face was cold, hard, uncracked, but his eyes, those eyes, were burning with a low fire Tanya had never seen and would never want to see. "Get ready, Tanya," he told his reflection. "I'm going to peel off every layer of your mask, one layer at a time." Bryce stepped out of the bathroom, his face now completely an iron mask. He moved through the crowd of laughing guests, nodding to a few partners, taking a practiced sip from the glass in his hand to keep up appearances, but his feet carried him straight to the door that led down to the kitchen. He pushed the kitchen door open, and the sight in front of him made his heart, a heart hardened by so many years at the top of the underworld, suddenly soften in a way it hadn't softened in a lifetime. Martha, the cook who'd been with the Harrington family since Bryce was a child, was sitting at the kitchen table. The two babies lay in a wicker basket lined with a clean towel, set right in the middle of scattered vegetables and herbs. She was feeding them milk from 2 small bottles she must have turned the whole house upside down to find. The babies had stopped crying, their eyes squeezed shut, their tiny hands wrapped tightly around Martha's aged finger as if clinging to the last safety they could reach. "Mr. Bryce?" Martha looked up, worry in her voice. "Miss, Tanya told me not to feed them too much. She said someone would be coming to pick them up. But sir, they're so hungry. Look at them sucking on this finger. It's heartbreaking." Bryce didn't answer right away. He stepped to the basket and looked down. One of the babies, as if sensing someone close, slowly opened its eyes, and Bryce almost took a step back. Those eyes, blue-gray, clear, deep, Keith's eyes, Harrington eyes. Bryce didn't need any test to know who these children were. Blood didn't lie. He offered his index finger, touching the baby's tiny hand. Instantly, 5 little fingers, like flower petals, closed around his finger and squeezed with a strength that shocked him. So strong it felt as if someone had grabbed his heart instead of his hand. That moment was brief, silent, with no music, no dialogue, no soundtrack. Just a mafia boss standing in a kitchen, letting a newborn hold his finger, and knowing that from this second on, he would burn the whole world down if he had to, just to keep these 2 small lives safe. Bryce drew his hand back gently, lifted his eyes to Martha, and his voice now was no longer the voice of a homeowner speaking to his cook. It was an order, cold, final, no room for questions or hesitation. "No one takes them, Martha. No one. You feed them until they're full. You give them everything they need. Whatever they require, you take it. And if Tanya asks, tell her you still haven't found any milk." Martha stared at him with old eyes that had witnessed too much in this house. And she understood. This wasn't a request. This was a command. The kind of command that in Bryce Harrington's world, disobeying didn't mean getting fired. It meant disappearing. "Yes, sir," Martha nodded, pulling the babies closer. Bryce took out his phone and typed a quick message to 2 names in his contacts that no one at this party would ever guess were exactly who they were. Vincent and Ray, 2 men in black suits with earpieces, blended in as event security, but in truth they were Bryce's 2 most trusted men, the kind who'd do anything the moment a message came from their boss. The message was short. "Guard the kitchen door. If anyone comes in who isn't Martha, stop them. No questions. No explanations." He sent it, slid the phone back into his pocket, drew a deep breath, and walked back into the party. The jazz still flowed smooth, champagne still ran like a stream, and the upper-class guests still laughed as if the world outside didn't exist. Bryce took a fresh glass from a tray, positioned himself where he could watch the entire living room, and he waited. He didn't have to wait long. The side door behind the dining room, the door only staff used, cracked open. A figure slipped in, hunched low, eyes flicking fast like a rat's. He wore a cheap suit, tight and wrinkled, the kind anyone could tell didn't belong in this party. His face was gaunt, his cheeks hollow, and a faint scar ran from the corner of his eye down to his cheekbone. Benny, the rat. Bryce recognized him instantly. In New York's underworld, Benny was the kind of sewer rat who took the filthy jobs nobody wanted, the kind of man who'd sell his own mother if the price was high enough. Benny crept in, trying to blend with the servers carrying trays, but he moved with the clumsy panic of a cockroach on a white tablecloth. From across the room, Tanya saw him. Bryce caught that look, that quick glance Tanya sent Benny, almost invisible if you didn't know what you were looking for. A slight nod, a flick of her eyes toward the kitchen door. "Go, into the kitchen. Take the kids." Benny understood. He turned and moved faster. He slipped past the dining room, dodging servers, his eyes fixed on the kitchen door at the end of the hall. 10 steps. 8. 5. His hand reached for the kitchen handle, and in that exact moment, Bryce Harrington's voice rang out, slicing through the music, the laughter, the clink of glasses, like thunder on a sunny day. Security. One word, but it was the boss's word. The music cut. Every conversation died. 200 pairs of eyes swung to Bryce. And Benny, his hand still on the handle, felt 2 hands like iron clamps seize his shoulders from behind. Vincent and Ray, 2 tall, cold men, appeared from either side like ghosts, lifting Benny off the ground before he could touch that kitchen door even 1 more inch. "Let me go," Benny fought, panic in his eyes as he looked toward Tanya. "She sent me. She told me to take—" "Drunk thief!" Tanya shrieked from the middle of the crowd, her voice sharp, her face changing color, still forcing the performance. "I don't know this man. He must have snuck in to steal. Throw him out." Bryce looked at Tanya, then at Benny. He said nothing, only nodded once at Vincent. "Hand him to the police. Tell them he trespassed." Benny was dragged away, his shoes scraping the polished stone floor, his mouth still babbling. Tanya let out a breath, her shoulders dropping. Her eyes flashing with relief, she tried to hide beneath a shell of fake shock. She thought she'd escaped. She thought Benny's arrest was a small risk she could deal with later, as long as Bryce didn't know anything. But just as Tanya was congratulating herself in her own mind, the doorbell rang. A low, resonant, luxurious chime announcing new arrivals. Bryce went to open the door, and 2 men stepped in. One wore a gray suit, carried a brown leather briefcase, and had gold-rimmed glasses. Attorney Caldwell, who'd served the Harrington family for 30 years. Beside him was a silver-haired man carrying a steel medical case, the private doctor Bryce trusted without question. Bryce turned back and faced Tanya in the living room, in front of 200 wide, curious eyes. His voice was calm, gentle, as if he were talking about the weather. "Tanya, you said the babies are distant relatives, right? Then there's nothing to worry about. But tonight's been a mess, so before we send them anywhere, I want to clear something up. The doctor will take DNA samples from the babies. The attorney will witness it. If there's nothing hidden, then tomorrow morning we'll laugh it off and forget this ever happened." The room went utterly still. Tanya stood in the middle of the crowd, champagne flute in her hand, her smile frozen on her lips, and then the glass slipped from her fingers, hit the marble floor, and shattered into 100 pieces. The sharp crack of breaking crystal rang through the silence, like the first fracture in the wall of lies Tanya had built for so many years. While the sound of shattering glass still echoed through the Harrington mansion, somewhere else in the city, dozens of blocks away, Melody Reeves was living in a completely different world. The 19th precinct at night was the saddest place anyone could imagine. The holding cells were down in the basement, where flickering fluorescent lights cast a sickly yellow glow, where gray concrete walls were blotched with damp stains, and the air was heavy with bleach mixed with sweat and despair. They'd taken Melody's shoes, taken her belt, taken even the only hair clip she owned. She sat barefoot on the freezing cement floor, her back against a wall slick with condensation, her arms wrapped around her knees, curled into herself as small as she could, as if she could disappear from this world. Every time a shadow passed by, Melody lifted her head, eyes red and swollen, voice hoarse from crying too much. "Please, let me make one phone call. Just one. I need to tell Mr. Harrington the truth. Please." The guard at the desk at the end of the hall didn't even bother to look up. "Shut up. Child kidnappers don't get to demand anything. You should be grateful we haven't sent you to central lockup yet. That's where you'll learn what suffering really is." Melody slid down, her back scraping the wall until she was sitting flat on the floor. She wasn't crying for herself. She'd been used to hardship since she was little. Used to being looked down on, used to being invisible in the world of the rich. But she couldn't bear the thought that the babies were in Tanya's hands. She kissed her own palm, the palm that still held the faint warmth of 2 tiny lives she'd cradled for 3 hours in the dark. "I'm sorry, babies," Melody whispered, her voice breaking apart. "I promised I'd protect you, and I failed. I'm so useless." From the cell beside hers, a woman's rough voice rose, the voice of someone who'd lived too many years on the shadowed side of life. "Hey, kid, you look too soft to be in here. What'd you do?" "I didn't do anything," Melody choked out. "I just wanted to save 2 babies." The woman on the other side let out a bitter laugh, without malice, only the understanding of someone who'd lost too many times. Mess with rich people and you're finished, sweetheart. Money always wins. The law's only for the ones who can afford to buy it. Melody closed her eyes. The darkness behind her lids felt gentler than reality. She thought of her grandmother back home, the only old woman in the world who'd ever loved her, waiting for the money Melody sent every month. She thought of Mr. Bryce. Would he believe her? Or was he cursing her now, calling her a traitor? The thought that the man she'd quietly admired for 2 years might see her as a criminal hurt more than any bruise on her body. But Melody didn't know, couldn't know, that danger wasn't only inside this cell. Danger was being planted from far away, from the very mansion she'd cleaned every day. While Melody shivered in the dark, on the Upper East Side the party was over. The last guest had left, abandoning half-finished drinks and whispers about the strange scandal of the night. Tanya retreated into Bryce's study, closed the door, then locked it. She knew Bryce was busy with the attorney and the doctor in the living room, busy with that ridiculous DNA test. Tanya needed time, and she needed to move fast. First came the phone call. Tanya dialed, waited through 3 rings, and then a low female voice answered. "I need a favor," Tanya said, her voice cold as ice. "There's a new girl in the women's wing of the 19th precinct tonight. Her name is Melody Reeves. I want you to tell your people in there to teach her a lesson, the kind of lesson where in the morning they find her on the bathroom floor. You know what I mean?" Silence for a second, then the voice on the other end. "How much?" "Enough that you won't ask a second question." Tanya hung up without a tremor. She had just ordered a human death as easily as ordering dinner delivered to her door. Next, Tanya walked to the large painting on the wall behind Bryce's desk, lifted it away, revealing a digital safe. She entered the code, 6 numbers she'd memorized long ago in secret, and the steel door opened with a soft click. Inside were cash, passports, important documents, and in the bottom compartment, wrapped in black velvet, a small silver pistol, the kind Bryce kept for protection. Tanya picked up the gun, turned it over in her hands, felt its weight, the weight of power, of control, of the final choice. She slipped it into her leather evening purse, a perfect fit, hidden so well no one would suspect. As she was about to close the safe, her eyes caught something tucked deep in the corner, an old photograph, stiff-backed, its edges yellowed with age. In the picture was a young woman with voluminous black hair, bright eyes, a smile that carried authority and warmth at once. Harriet Whitfield in her youth, Tanya's grandmother, the woman who had once been the pillar of the entire Whitfield line. Tanya stared at the photo, and instead of anything that could be called family, her eyes flashed only with contempt. "Rot in that nursing home in Florida," Tanya whispered, her lips curving into a cold smile. "You don't know anything. You never knew anything. It's all mine." She tossed the photograph into the trash beside the desk. When it hit the bottom, it made a small sound, dry and sorrowful, like the sigh of a family bond thrown away without mercy. Tanya closed the safe, hung the painting back, smoothed her hair in the mirror. In her mind, Plan B had taken shape, sharp and clear. If everything went smoothly, the DNA results would be switched by her people in the lab. Melody wouldn't survive the night, and the babies would vanish into an orphanage system no one could trace. But if things didn't go smoothly, if somehow Bryce discovered too much, then the gun in her purse would solve the problem. A staged suicide, a grand funeral, and Tanya Whitfield would become the widow who inherited the Harrington empire. She looked into the mirror one last time, smiled a smile only a devil could wear, then turned off the light and walked out. And on 2 ends of the city, 2 women were living in 2 completely opposite worlds. One was curled on a freezing cement floor, praying for 2 babies she loved with her whole heart. One stood before a mirror in rich golden light, planning to kill anyone who dared stand in her way. Melody didn't know death was being sent to her, inside the bars and outside the bars. She only knew how to hold her knees, close her eyes, and whisper the babies' names like a prayer. But there was one thing neither Melody nor Tanya knew. Somewhere in the mansion, Bryce Harrington was sitting in the dark, staring at Keith's photograph, and sharpening every next step with the cold precision of a man who was used to winning games, where the loser paid with their life. The longest night of Bryce Harrington's life didn't pass in the bed of his luxurious master suite. It passed in the leather chair of his study, one hand holding a whiskey glass that had been empty for a long time, the other gripping Keith's framed photograph. The picture was from when they were kids. Bryce at 12, Keith at 8, grinning wide at Coney Island. 2 boys who didn't yet know anything about the underworld, about power, about greed. Bryce stared into Keith's laughing eyes and whispered, his voice raw from staying awake all night. "I'm sorry, kid. I let the enemy into our home. I slept beside your killer and didn't know. But I swear, Keith, I swear to you, I'll fix everything." At 7 in the morning, the phone vibrated on the oak desk. Bryce picked it up before the second buzz could even sound. The doctor's voice on the other end was calm, professional. But Bryce could hear the emotion he was trying to hold back. "Mr. Harrington, the results are in. 99.9% match to Keith Harrington's DNA sample in the family gene bank. The 2 babies are your nephew and niece. There's no doubt left. They're Harrington blood." Bryce didn't speak. He closed his eyes. A single tear rolled down his cheek. Slow, heavy, hot, and fell onto the glass of Keith's smiling photo in his hand. They were Keith's children. His brother's blood. His blood. The family Bryce had thought he'd lost when Keith died was still here after all. Still breathing. Still alive. Lying in a wicker basket in his kitchen. Threatened by the very woman he'd almost married. "Thank you, doctor," Bryce said, his voice low but steady. "Prepare the official report. I need it today." He hung up, set Keith's photograph down, stood, and strode out of the study. There was no time left for more pain. Keith was gone, but Keith's children were alive. And Melody, the one who'd risked her life to save them, was trapped in a holding cell with the hand of death Tanya had sent toward her. While Bryce drove through the early morning haze of Manhattan streets still nearly empty, Melody was facing something she'd never been prepared for at the 19th precinct. Morning in lockup began with a harsh iron bell and a line of women shuffling for breakfast, a bowl of thin porridge and a hard piece of bread. Melody stood at the end of the line, head bowed, trying to make herself as small as possible, but smallness didn't save her. A large shadow blocked her path. Melody looked up and saw a big woman, shoulders broad as a man's, a spiderweb tattoo climbing her neck, eyes flat and cold, a slow smile spreading across a scarred face. The boss of the women's wing, the one every inmate lowered their eyes for when she passed. "You Melody, right?" Her voice was deep, slow, like stone grinding against stone. "Heard you've been causing trouble. Someone paid me to teach you a lesson." Melody backed up until her spine hit the wall. Nowhere left to go. The boss stepped closer, one arm loose at her side, the other hidden behind her back, and Melody saw it, only for a flash but long enough to freeze her blood. A toothbrush sharpened to a point, the most terrifying homemade weapon in any jail. "I didn't cause trouble," Melody said, her voice shaking but her eyes holding steady. "I was just protecting 2 babies." "Don't care," the boss sneered. "I got paid, not to listen to your life story." She raised her arm. Melody shut her eyes, held her breath. She thought of the babies, of the tiny eyes that had looked at her in the darkness of the trunk, of the promise she hadn't been able to keep. If she died here, no one would know, no one would remember. Just a nameless housemaid dead in a prison fight the police would wrap up in 2 minutes and forget. But fate, that thing that loved to mock people and yet sometimes chose to show mercy, stepped in at the last second. Melody Reeves. A shout rang from the far end of the corridor, a guard's voice, urgent and sharp. "Get out here. You're being released. Bail. Someone posted bail for you." The boss froze, her hand inches from Melody's face. Her eyes narrowed, cold, calculating, and then she lowered her arm, slowly, and spat onto the floor right beside Melody's foot. "Lucky," she murmured, low enough that only Melody could hear. "But remember, accidents happen outside too." Melody didn't have time to think about the threat. She only knew how to run. Run after the guard through gray hallways, past heavy steel doors, past the processing room where she signed her name with a hand shaking so hard her signature became a crooked line. And then she stood before the final door, the door that led to the outside world. She pushed it open. The first sunlight of the new day hit her eyes, blinding, stinging, forcing her to lift an arm to shield her face. After so many hours in darkness, the light felt like a gentle slap and a cruel one at the same time. Melody squinted, trying to see, and little by little the image in front of her sharpened. A sleek black Rolls-Royce parked right at the precinct entrance, and leaning against the car door, arms crossed over his chest, dark sunglasses hiding the shadows of a sleepless night. White shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, no suit jacket, no tie, looking exhausted yet still carrying a power no tailored suit could create, was Bryce. He smiled, a small smile, tired, but warm in a way Melody had never seen on that usually cold face. Melody ran. She didn't think. She didn't remember he was the boss and she was the maid. She didn't remember he was a kingpin and she was a nobody. She only ran, bare feet slapping the concrete, her rumpled uniform whipping in the morning wind, and she threw herself straight into Bryce's arms. He caught her. Strong arms closed around Melody's thin body, one hand settling at the back of her neck, shielding, protecting, holding tight. Melody sobbed into his chest, tears soaking his expensive white shirt, and Bryce didn't care. "You really believe me?" Melody whispered, her words breaking inside the sobs. "I believe you," Bryce said, his voice low, steady, certain as stone. "I read the letter. I know everything. And I posted the highest bail in this precinct's history to get you out. Get in the car. It's not safe here. I'll explain on the way." Bryce drove through streets that were waking up, heading toward Lower Manhattan, to Tribeca, where he owned a penthouse apartment no one knew about. Not even Tanya, not even his lawyers, only Martha and his two most trusted men. It was the Harrington boss's last refuge, the place he used for the most dangerous times, and today was one of those times. The elevator opened on the top floor. Melody stepped into the apartment, her eyes still swollen red, and then she stopped short. The living room was wide and flooded with sunlight from towering windows that looked out over the Hudson River, and in the center of the room, on a white sofa, Martha was sitting. The babies lay in a portable bassinet beside her, sleeping peacefully, safe, full bellies, wrapped in clean blankets. Melody lifted a hand to cover her mouth. Her legs buckled, then steadied, and then she ran to the bassinet, dropped to her knees, trembling hands touching the soft cheeks of each baby, and she cried. Not the broken crying of the holding cell, but the crying of someone who had just found the most precious thing they'd believed was gone forever. "Babies," Melody whispered, tears falling onto the white blanket. I'm here. One baby opened its eyes and looked at Melody, and tiny hands lifted, reaching for her, as if recognizing the voice that had sung to them in the dark for 3 hours. Martha wiped her tears with the corner of her apron and turned away, not wanting anyone to see her cry. Bryce stood in the doorway of the living room, silent. He didn't step inside. He only leaned against the frame and watched Melody gather the babies into her arms, watched her kiss their foreheads, watched her smile through tears. Then he quietly backed away and pulled the half-open door closer, giving Melody her own space, giving her the reunion she deserved after everything she'd endured. Bryce leaned against the hallway wall outside, closed his eyes, tipped his head back, and let out a long, heavy breath, as if he were releasing the sleepless night, the rage, the grief of losing his brother. But inside that breath was something else, too. Something Bryce hadn't named yet, or hadn't dared to name. Something warm, something more dangerous than any war he'd ever fought, because it didn't come from his underworld. It came from the deepest place in his chest, the place Boss Harrington had believed he'd sealed shut a long time ago, when the babies were sleeping soundly, and Martha sat watch beside the bassinet. Bryce tapped lightly on the living room door and stepped in. Melody was sitting on the floor beside the bassinet, her hand still resting on the baby's chest as if she feared that if she pulled away they would vanish. She looked up at him, her eyes still red but calmer now, holding a small returning light that last night had almost been extinguished. Bryce sat down beside her, not on a chair, but right on the floor, shoulder to shoulder, two adults, sitting on the floor of a multi-million-dollar penthouse, like two children, discussing something that mattered more than anything. "Melody, I need to tell you a few things," Bryce began, his voice low, serious. "The DNA results confirmed it. The babies are Keith's biological children. They're my niece and nephew." Melody wasn't surprised. She'd known it already, but hearing Bryce confirm it in that steady voice still made her close her eyes and breathe out in relief. "Tonight," Bryce continued, staring straight ahead, "is the official engagement party. This time there will be press, business partners, all the most important faces in New York. Tanya thinks she's won. She thinks you're rotting in a cell. She thinks the DNA results have already been switched because she sent someone to buy off the lab." Melody turned to him, eyes widening. "She bribed the lab?" "Tried to," Bryce said, and a cold smile flickered across his mouth, the kind of smile that would make scarred smugglers in the underworld go still, if they ever saw it. "But I blocked her first. My people got to the lab before hers did. The real results are sitting safely with Attorney Caldwell." He said it gently, like he was talking about the weather, but Melody felt the weight behind every word. This was the man whose name New York whispered in fear, and he was using the full reach of his underground power network not for business, not for territory, but to protect her, a maid who 24 hours ago was still mopping his floors. "Tonight you're going to that party," Bryce said, turning to look at Melody. "Not as a maid." Melody blinked. "I don't understand." "You'll go with me. Walk through the front doors, in front of everyone." "But," Melody shook her head, panic rising, "I don't know how to be a lady. I don't know how to hold a wine glass the right way, how to talk to those wives. I'm a maid, Mr. Bryce. I only know how to mop floors and wash dishes." Bryce looked at her. For a long time, those steel-gray eyes, the eyes that had made scarred traffickers drop their gaze, softened now like a lake after a storm. "I don't need a lady," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "I need you. Brave, honest, and beautiful. Last night you climbed into a trunk to save 2 babies you didn't owe a thing to. That's worth more than all the expensive dresses and empty words in that ballroom put together. Tonight the stage is going to collapse, and you're going to sit in the front row and watch Tanya pay for everything." Martha, the loyal cook, became a backstage sorceress. She tore through the apartment and found an emerald green evening gown Bryce had once bought for a charity event, but no one had ever worn, still with the tags on, hanging in the living room closet. She led Melody into the bathroom, helped her wash her hair, brushed it out, then patiently braided and shaped it into soft waves that spilled over Melody's shoulders. Light makeup, just a little powder, a little color, enough to bring out her deep brown eyes and the mouth that for so many days had only been pressed tight in endurance. Bryce stood outside in the living room, his back turned toward the bedroom door, pretending to read messages on his phone, though he wasn't reading a thing. He heard Martha's little exclamations, heard Melody's quiet laugh for the first time since last night, and heard something like the sound of a zipper being pulled. Then the bedroom door opened. Bryce turned and went still. Melody stood in the doorway in the emerald dress that hugged her slender frame softly, the silk falling like water, her hair in waves over bare shoulders, her eyes lit by something that wasn't makeup, but dignity returned. She didn't look like a magazine cover model. She looked better than that. Beautiful in a way money couldn't buy. Beautiful with truth, with courage, with the bruises on her cheekbones that hadn't fully faded yet, but were hidden beneath a thin veil of powder and a great deal of strength inside her. Bryce Harrington, the man who had negotiated with the most dangerous bosses on the East Coast without ever trembling, the man who had stood in front of a gun barrel and still joked, now stood in his own living room and couldn't find a single word. For the first time in his life, Boss Harrington was silent. He looked at Melody, not as a maid anymore, not as a victim to be rescued, but as the woman he knew, with a certainty that frightened him, that he couldn't afford to lose. "You," Bryce swallowed, his voice going rough in a way he couldn't control. "You're beautiful." Melody blushed, lowered her gaze, then lifted it again because she remembered she had decided she wouldn't bow her head to anyone anymore. "Don't look at me like that," she said softly, but the corner of her mouth curved just slightly, just enough to make Bryce feel his heart, the heart he'd believed had turned to stone long ago, skip one beat. The Rolls-Royce stopped at the Harrington Mansion gates, just after the sky went fully dark. Camera flashes popped without pause like lightning. Paparazzi packed tight along both sides of the red carpet. Expensive lenses aimed at the car door, waiting for the arrival of New York's most powerful couple. Bryce stepped out first, buttoning his black 3-piece suit, his features cut sharp under the lights. Then he turned and offered his hand inside the car. Melody placed her hand in his, trembling faintly, but she stepped out. The emerald dress caught the flash and threw it back in shards of light. Her waved hair lifted in the Manhattan night breeze. She stood straight, chin raised, and walked beside Bryce down the red carpet. Whispers spread through the crowd like fire skimming water. "Who is she?" "That's not Tanya." "Oh my God, she's gorgeous. Is she a model?" Inside the grand hall, at the top of the curved marble staircase, Tanya stood greeting guests, glowing in a gold gown covered in stones, the perfect hostess smile on her face. She looked down at the front doors and that smile died on her mouth. The champagne glass in her hand tilted, then slipped from trembling fingers, fell onto the marble steps, shattered, and golden liquid splashed across white stone like spilled tears. Tanya drew a deep breath, forced her smile back into place, and walked down the stairs, one step, then another, heels striking marble like a countdown to an explosion. "Oh," Tanya said. loud enough for the entire hall to hear, her voice sweet in a way that made people's stomachs turn, but her eyes sharp as a blade. "I didn't realize we had a charity performance tonight. You brought your maid to the party too, Bryce? How adorable." A few soft laughs scattered through the guests. The upper class loved drama, and they'd just been served a full plate. Bryce didn't answer. He simply stood there, his hand still resting at the small of Melody's back, waiting. Because he knew, he could feel, that the woman beside him tonight was no longer the maid who used to lower her eyes. And he was right. Melody looked straight into Tanya's eyes. No bowing, no shaking, no stepping back. For the first time in 2 years, she stared into the eyes of the woman who had crushed her every day, and she didn't blink. "I'm not going anywhere, Miss Tanya," Melody said, her voice clear, calm, carrying far enough for the people around them to hear. "And if I were you, I'd worry more about what's about to be exposed tonight than about my dress." Silence dropped over the hall like a heavy curtain. Tanya stood there, her mouth slightly open, her eyes wide, for the first time in her life being stared down by the maid she'd always called useless, and answered back. Bryce smiled, slipped an arm around Melody's waist, and led her past Tanya into the heart of the glittering hall. The crowd split automatically, making space for them, like making way for a king and queen. And Tanya remained behind, alone, her hand clenched at her side, her nails digging into her palm until skin broke, her eyes bloodshot as she watched Melody's back in that emerald dress, and in that stare there was no contempt left at all, only pure hatred, thick and concentrated, the kind that didn't need a knife to kill. Half an hour slipped by in the grand hall as Bryce led Melody through the crowd, introducing her to his partners not with the title of housekeeper, but with the words, "The woman who saved my family's legacy." And every time that sentence landed in the air, Tanya, standing in the corner of the room, tightened her grip on her wineglass a little more, her nails tapping the crystal as if she were counting down. She couldn't endure it any longer. When the orchestra stopped playing and the small stage lights at the far end of the hall flickered on, Tanya moved first. She charged up onto the stage as fast as 12-inch heels would allow, snatched the microphone from the host's hand, and turned to face the 200 guests with the brightest smile she could force into place. The kind of smile Bryce could now see was fake down to the tiniest crease at the corner of her eyes. "Welcome, everyone," Tanya called out, sharp and confident, as if nothing unusual were happening at all. "Thank you for coming tonight. Bryce and I have wonderful news. We've decided to move the wedding date up. This weekend, this very weekend, we'll officially become husband and wife." Scattered applause followed, thin and confused. Guests looked at one another, looked up at Tanya on the stage, then looked back at Bryce below, standing with an unfamiliar woman linked to his arm, and no one understood what was going on. Bryce set his drink down on the nearest table, gave Melody's hand a gentle squeeze as if to say, "It's time," then let go. He started toward the stage, slowly, one step at a time. Each footfall struck the polished wood like a war drum. The crowd fell silent on instinct, because when Bryce Harrington walked with that rhythm, with that face, even people who didn't know his name could feel in their bones that something enormous was about to happen. He climbed onto the stage, stopped beside Tanya, and held out his hand. He didn't yank, he didn't snatch. He simply extended his arm, palm up, and looked Tanya in the eye with a gaze she had never seen before, a gaze with no love in it, and no anger, only an ending. Tanya stared at his hand, then at his eyes, and with the survival instinct of a professional liar, she knew something was wrong. But under 200 pairs of eyes, she couldn't refuse. She placed the microphone into Bryce's hand with a stiff smile, tried to loop her arm through his, but Bryce shifted to the side and avoided the contact so naturally that only Tanya understood it was rejection. "Thank you, Tanya, for that enthusiastic announcement," Bryce said into the microphone, his voice calm and deep, the voice of a man in complete control of the room. "But before we talk about a wedding, I want to talk about something more important. Family, blood, and truths that have been buried for far too long beneath a layer of lies." The smile on Tanya's face died in place. She stepped forward, reaching for the microphone, but Bryce turned his body to block her, gentle yet immovable as a steel wall, and kept speaking without even glancing back at her. "Everyone here knows my younger brother, Keith Harrington, died 1 year ago in an accident. But Keith left behind something no one knew." Bryce signaled the sound technician. The giant screen behind the stage, the screen prepared to play romantic photos of the couple, suddenly blazed to life with something entirely different. A document, enlarged, clear, razor-sharp. The logo of the most prestigious genetic testing laboratory in the United States sat in the upper corner. Beneath it were numbers and bold lines of text anyone could read. Probability of biological relationship, 99.9%. Conclusion. The tested subject is the biological child of Keith Harrington. The hall erupted in murmurs. Oh my God, Keith's child. Keith had a child and nobody knew? Bryce waited for the noise to settle before he continued. And now his voice no longer carried the smooth calm of business, but the weight of an older brother demanding justice for his own. Keith had 2 children, twin babies, and someone wanted them to disappear from the face of the earth, to vanish before I ever learned they existed. But they're alive. They're alive not because of the police, not because of lawyers, not because of anyone in this room. They're alive because of one woman who risked her life. Bryce lifted his hand and pointed toward Melody standing below. The spotlight shifted, found her in the crowd, and lit up her sea-green dress and the face struggling to hold back tears. Melody pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heart hammer so hard she thought everyone around her must be able to hear it. Melody Reeves, Bryce said, and her name rang through the hall like a declaration. The bravest woman I've ever met in my life. Applause began, at first from only a few people, scattered and cautious. Then it spread, stronger, louder, until the entire hall thundered. Melody bit her lip, tears streaming. But she didn't bow her head. She didn't hide. She stood there and met every gaze with her back straight, and her chin lifted. Tanya on the stage couldn't take it anymore. She stepped forward, her shrill voice cutting through the clapping. Forged! It's all forged! That girl is a con artist. She forged the papers. She bribed the doctor. Don't listen. She's just a housekeeper after money. Bryce turned to Tanya. Slowly, those steel-gray eyes held not a trace of feeling that could be called affection. Only the icy disgust of a man looking down at an enemy already defeated, still unaware she's lost. Forged, Tanya? Bryce repeated, his voice so soft it was frightening. Then explain to me why you paid $50,000 to a man named Benny the Rat to make the 2 babies disappear. The hall dropped into absolute silence, the kind of silence where you could hear the candles burning on the banquet tables. Tanya opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, like a fish pulled from the water. I don't know any Benny. You're insane. Do you? Bryce pressed a button on the small remote in his hand. The hall's sound system, a system that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and was built for lavish parties, now poured out something that wasn't jazz and wasn't a congratulatory speech. It was a voice. Tanya's voice. Clear, cold, unmistakable. I don't care what you do with them. Throw them away, sell them, I don't care. As long as Bryce doesn't see them. If he finds out those brats exist, I lose everything. Do you understand? Everything. The recording ended. Its last echo hung in the air like poisonous smoke. Then the reaction exploded. Gasps of horror, hands flying to mouths, chairs scraping as people stood. A silver-haired woman at the front table turned away, shaking her head. 2 women Tanya had always called her closest friends, the 2 who sat beside her at every party, stepped back 3 paces, then 5, then 10, dragging their chairs away as if Tanya carried something contagious. Tanya stood in the center of the stage, the spotlight still pouring straight down on her, and there was nowhere left to hide. She looked to the right and saw faces turning away. She looked to the left and met eyes full of disgust. She looked down and understood the crowd was no longer her audience, but a jury, and every gaze had already delivered its verdict. The final mask fell. There was no socialite, no perfect fiancé, no seductive smile. There was only Tanya Whitfield, stripped bare under the lights, her wild eyes darting, her breathing sharp, her chest heaving like a trapped animal shoved into the corner of a pen after every exit has been slammed shut. Bryce watched Tanya standing alone at the center of the stage, watched her shudder in waves like an animal forced up against the wall, and he delivered his final line in a voice as flat as a sentence being read aloud. The police are on their way, Tanya, and this time, they're not coming for Melody. In that moment, the moment Tanya Whitfield understood every door had slammed shut, every escape had been sealed, every lie had been burned to ash in front of 200 witnesses. That moment did something no one in the hall expected. It didn't make Tanya collapse. It made Tanya go mad. Laughter tore out of her throat. But it wasn't normal laughter. And it wasn't the polished, manufactured laugh she'd worn at parties. It was shattered laughter, the sound of a mind hitting its limit and ripping every restraint clean in half. A crazed peal that rose in the dead quiet of the grand hall and made the hair on the back of people's necks stand up. Ha 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 ha. Police? The police are coming to arrest me? Tanya laughed, eyes blazing, hair coming loose, her gold dress glittering under the spotlight like the armor of a queen turned insane. No one arrests Tanya Whitfield. No one. Her hand plunged into the leather clutch tucked beneath her arm and pulled out something that took the room a single beat to recognize. A silver pistol. Small, gleaming, deadly. The gun she'd taken from Bryce's safe last night, hidden in her purse like a final trump card. Tanya aimed it straight at Bryce's chest, only a few steps away, close enough not to miss, far enough that no one could get to her in time. "Nobody move," Tanya shrieked, her high voice booming through the sound system, because the microphone on stage was still live. The hall detonated into chaos. Guests screamed, hit the floor, dove under tables, clung to one another. Wine glasses crashed and shattered. Chairs toppled with heavy thuds. A silver-haired woman fainted right there on the red carpet. And in the middle of all that, Bryce Harrington didn't move. He stood perfectly still, eyes locked on Tanya's eyes, both hands lifting slowly to shoulder height, palms open. No fear, no panic. His face was stone cold, and when he spoke, it was the voice of negotiation. The voice of a man who'd sat across from drug lords, arms dealers, professional killers, and walked away from every one of those conversations alive. "Put the gun down, Tanya," Bryce said, slow, one word at a time. "You've lost. Everyone's heard it. Everyone's seen it. There isn't a way back that can save you now. But if you lower the gun, at least you'll keep your life." Tanya shook her head, the pistol trembling in her hand yet still pointed straight at Bryce's heart. "Lost? I don't ever lose. I want the car, I want the private jet keys, I want passports, and I want out of this city before the cops set foot through that door." "All right." Bryce nodded, his voice still unnaturally calm. "I'll give you everything. Take me hostage. I'm the one who signs the checks. I'm the one with value. Let Melody and everyone else go." But Tanya wasn't stupid. Inside the madness, her cunning mind still worked with ruthless precision. She looked at Bryce. Then she looked down below the stage where Melody stood, face drained white, both hands clenched around the back of a chair, eyes fixed on the gun. "No," Tanya whispered, and the smile on her lips became the most horrifying smile anyone in the hall had ever seen. "I don't need you. She's what you love. I saw it in your eyes tonight, Bryce, the way you looked at that housekeeper. You've never looked at me like that. Not once." Tanya lunged off the stage, so fast no one reacted in time, one hand seizing Melody's arm, the other pressing the silver pistol to Melody's temple. Melody sucked in a sharp breath, but she didn't scream, and she didn't fight. She only stood there, eyes straight on Bryce, as if to say, "Don't do something reckless." "Step back," Tanya screamed at Bryce, dragging Melody toward the stage, the gun mashed hard against Melody's skin. "One more step and I'll pull the trigger." Bryce went rigid, and for the first time that night, maybe for the first time in his life, the Harrington boss felt fear. Not fear for himself, because he'd been ready to die for a long time, but fear for her, for the woman with a gun to her head who still didn't cry, who still tried to stay steady, who still looked at him with those deep brown eyes full of courage. Bryce's face stayed cold, but his hands clenched at his sides, clenched until his knuckles blanched, and his heart beat in a rhythm he couldn't control. He was calculating, searching for an angle, trying to think of anything that could save Melody without making that gun go off, when the main doors of the grand hall flew open. Not gently. They burst wide. The heavy oak doors slammed into the walls with a boom like thunder, and everyone, Tanya included, turned to look. A wheelchair rolled into the center of the hall, pushed by a nurse in white. And sitting in that wheelchair was an elderly woman, hair white as snow, skin lined with time, a small body nearly swallowed by a gray wool coat. But her eyes were sharp as blades, bright as headlights. The eyes of someone who'd lived 82 years and refused to lose to anyone, not even death. Harriet Whitfield. Tanya froze, the gun lowered by an inch, only an inch, but it was enough for Bryce to notice. Tanya's face, the face stamped with madness, suddenly became the face of a child who'd seen a ghost. "Grandmother?" Tanya blurted, her voice breaking. "You're in Florida. You can't be here." Harriet lifted a hand and signaled the nurse to stop the wheelchair. Then she looked up, straight into Tanya's eyes, and her voice came out not loud, but it filled the hall anyway, because in this murderous silence even a whisper sounded like a shout. "Put the gun down, you idiot." Tanya blinked as if she'd been slapped. Harriet went on, her voice trembling with age but cutting with rage. "You think locking me in a nursing home is the end of it? You think I'm some senile old woman who doesn't know anything? The bank called me this morning, Tanya. You withdrew money from the family trust, $600,000. Without my signature. You're a thief." Harriet paused, took a breath, then added in a voice, heavy as lead, "And if what they just played through those speakers is true, then you're a murderer, too." Tanya stared at her grandmother, the woman she'd shut away in a nursing home in Florida, the woman whose photo she'd thrown into the trash last night while snarling, "Rot and die in that place," the woman she'd assumed was harmless, now sitting here in the middle of the grand hall, before 200 witnesses, stripping her bare. Tanya lost focus, just for a second. A single second when her eyes left Bryce to lock on Harriet. A single second when the hand holding the gun dropped another inch. But a second was everything Bryce Harrington needed. He lunged, fast, decisive, exact, like a panther that's measured every centimeter before it strikes. His hand clamped around Tanya's wrist, crushing tight, twisting up, forcing the gun toward the ceiling. Tanya screamed, her finger yanking the trigger in blind panic. The blast shook the hall, a violent crack, the echo ricocheting off marble walls. The bullet flew upward and tore straight into the massive crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling. The chandelier exploded, thousands of crystal shards raining down like diamond storm, glittering under the spotlight, breathtakingly beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Tanya clawed, bit, fought like a feral cat caught by the scruff. But Bryce was stronger. He wrenched her wrist until metal clattered to the floor. The silver pistol skidded across the polished stone. But Tanya wasn't out of cards yet. With her free hand, she yanked a small knife from beneath the hem of her dress, the blade short but razor sharp, and drove it toward Bryce's side. He saw the blade flash in the light. He shifted away, but he was half a beat too slow, and the knife sliced through the edge of his vest, tearing fabric without touching skin. Before Tanya could stab a second time, before Bryce could turn and counter, a shadow surged in from behind. Melody. She grabbed a large porcelain vase from the nearest banquet table, heavy, packed with white lilies, water spilling and soaking her hands, and she didn't care. "Let go of my man," Melody shouted, her voice loud, fierce, so raw and powerful she didn't even recognize it as her own. And she brought the vase down on Tanya's head. Porcelain shattered, white lilies burst apart. Water sprayed everywhere. Tanya's eyes went wide. Her mouth opened but no sound came out. Her body swayed once, then again, then collapsed onto the marble floor. Unconscious. Silence. 3 seconds of absolute silence, then the entire hall erupted. Guests crawled up from under tables, from behind chairs, from every corner they'd hidden in, and they applauded. The applause rolled like thunder, mixed with cheers, whistles, and someone shouting, "Bravo!" Bryce stood there, breathing hard, his vest ripped in a long tear, a thin scratch on his face from a falling crystal shard, his hair disheveled, no longer looking like an untouchable boss, but like a man who'd just survived the fight of his life. He looked at Melody. She stood beside him, still holding a broken shard of the vase, hair loose and wild, her sea-green dress splashed with water. A white lily caught on her shoulder, breathing just as hard as he was. "My man?" Bryce repeated, the corner of his mouth lifting. Melody suddenly realized what she'd just screamed in front of 200 people. Her face flared red, redder than it had been under the spotlight, and she let the porcelain shard drop to the floor, flustered. I didn't mean..." But Bryce didn't let her finish. He stepped in, one arm sliding around her waist, the other lifting her chin, and he kissed her, right there in the middle of the grand hall, among shattered crystal and scattered lilies, beneath roaring applause and the cheers of 200 guests. The first kiss between the Mafia boss and the housekeeper didn't happen in a luxurious bedroom or under a romantic sunset. It happened in the wreckage, and maybe that was why it was more real than any kiss in any love story. Police sirens wailed outside the doors. 4 officers rushed in, assessed the scene in a heartbeat, then moved to Tanya lying on the floor. She'd come to, eyes swollen, hair streaked with a light smear of blood from the broken porcelain, staring up with pure, burning hatred. The snap of handcuffs locking shut rang out for the second time in this story, but this time it wasn't on Melody's wrists. "This isn't over," Tanya hissed through her teeth as the officers hauled her upright. "I'll come back. I swear I'll come back." The officer behind her, the one who'd witnessed the whole spectacle from beginning to end, leaned in and said exactly one sentence into Tanya's ear. "You won't be coming back from where you're going." 3 days after that fateful night, after the police had finished the reports, after the newspapers had filled their front pages with the headline, "Scandal of the Century at the Harrington Mansion," after Tanya Whitfield had been transferred from the holding station to a federal prison to await trial, with a list of charges as long as an arm, Bryce and attorney Caldwell finally began to search the last hidden corners Tanya had left behind. Tanya's private study sat on the 3rd floor of the mansion, a small room she always kept locked, and told Bryce was her meditation room. "I need my own space." Bryce had never questioned it, because he'd trusted Tanya, trusted her blindly, and now, as he forced the lock and stepped inside, he realized just how blind he'd been. Behind a false wall paneled with wood was a second safe, not Bryce's safe, but Tanya's personal one, a fireproof, waterproof model installed in secret. Caldwell had brought a professional locksmith, and after 20 minutes, the steel door swung open. Inside was a whole miniature world of darkness, files on bribing officials, receipts for transfers to Benny and other hired hands, ledgers recording hidden expenditures, overseas bank accounts with balances so staggering, Caldwell had to push his glasses up and read them twice. But all of it became small, all of it became meaningless, when Bryce's hand found what lay at the very bottom of the safe. A sealed plastic pouch, the kind used to preserve important documents, taped shut with care, as if what was inside were more precious than gold. Bryce opened it. Inside was an old birth certificate, yellowed with time, corners creased, but the printed letters still painfully clear. He read the first line, and his face drained of color. He read the second line and his hands began to shake. He reached the last line and had to sit down because his knees could no longer hold him. "Caldwell," Bryce said, his voice rough. "Bring Melody up here, right now." Melody entered the study with worry written across her face, because when Bryce called her in that voice, that unusually deep and slow voice, she knew something enormous was about to happen. Bryce stood, pulled out a chair for her, and said 2 words she never expected to hear. "Melody, sit down." She sat. Bryce placed the birth certificate in front of her, face up, and pointed to the line under father's name. Preston Whitfield. Melody stared at the name, blinked, frowned, and shook her head. "I don't understand. Who is Preston Whitfield?" Was Harriet Whitfield's eldest son. He was the man you thought was Tanya's father, but he was actually her uncle. Preston was the older brother of Tanya's real father, and according to this birth certificate, Preston is also your father, Melody. The room spun. Melody felt the floor tilt, the walls tilt, the entire world tilt. "No." She shook her head, eyes wide. "It can't be. My grandmother told me my mother was only a housekeeper for a rich family. My mother died when I was little. My grandmother never talked about my father." "Your grandmother was telling the truth," Bryce said as he sat beside her, his voice turning gentle again. "Your mother worked in the Whitfield house, the richest family in the region, and Preston, Harriet's eldest child, fell in love with your mother. A secret love, because back then the Whitfields wouldn't accept their son marrying a housekeeper. Preston died 28 years ago in an accident, just months before you were born. Your mother left, had you, and never returned, never told anyone who you were. But if that's true," Melody whispered, her voice trembling, "then I'm Harriet's granddaughter, Tanya's cousin, and under the Whitfield inheritance rules, you are the lawful heir, because Preston was the firstborn, and the firstborn's child comes before all others." Melody lifted a hand to cover her mouth. Tears spilled over, but she didn't know whether she was crying from shock, from pain, or because after 27 years in the dark, someone had suddenly turned on the light, and Tanya knew all of it. Bryce continued, his voice turning cold when he said her name. "She knew you existed. She knew who you were. And she deliberately found you, hired you into her home as a housekeeper, not because she needed someone to mop floors, but because she wanted to watch you, to grind you down every day, to make sure you, Harriet Whitfield's niece, would spend your life on your knees scrubbing for her without ever learning who you truly were. That was Tanya's game. That was the secret victory she savored every day. A heavy silence settled over the room. Melody sat there, tears pouring freely. 27 years of memory churning in her mind. 27 years of being treated as invisible. 27 years of keeping her head down and enduring. And now she understood that all along she'd been fooled, hidden, stripped of her name, by the very woman she'd called ma'am. The study door opened. Harriet Whitfield rolled in, her elderly eyes still sharp as they swept the room, saw the birth certificate on the table, saw Melody crying, and understood everything without a single explanation. She motioned the nurse to stop the wheelchair directly in front of Melody. Her old hand, bony and trembling, lifted and touched Melody's cheek, stroking softly, as if she were touching something sacred she'd thought lost forever. "These eyes," Harriet whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. Preston's eyes, sad and gentle. Exactly like my son." Melody looked at the woman in front of her, the grandmother she'd never known she had, and every wall she'd built over the years to protect herself collapsed in an instant. She slid from the chair, knelt on the floor, wrapped her arms around Harriet's thin legs, and cried like a child who'd been motherless for 27 years and had finally found the way home. Harriet laid a hand on Melody's head, stroked her hair, and her tears fell onto the dark strands of her granddaughter's hair. "Forgive me," she said, her voice thick. "That snake told me you died at birth. She said your mother took you away and both of you were lost in an accident. I believed it. I believed it because I didn't want to believe my own grandchild could lie to me. 27 years, Melody. 27 years I lived without knowing you existed." Melody couldn't speak. She only held on tighter, cried harder, and Harriet cried with her. 2 generations separated by greed and cruelty, now finding each other again in a small room filled with legal papers and tears. At last, Harriet lifted her head, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and when she spoke again, her voice no longer trembled. It rang, clear and commanding, the authority of a woman who'd built an empire before Tanya was even born. "From now on, no one will look down on you again, Melody. You are a Whitfield. You are my granddaughter. And I will spend the rest of my life making up for the 27 years we lost." 1 week after the truth about her identity was laid bare, after the tears had dried and the embraces with Harriet had settled into an ordinary kind of warmth, Melody made a request Bryce didn't want to hear. "I want to visit Tanya." Bryce was reading documents at his desk. He snapped his head up, set his pen down with a hard tap. "No, Bryce. She's poison, Melody. Every second you're near her is a second you're poisoning yourself. You don't need to see her face ever again." Melody stepped to the desk and laid her hand over his, gentle but steady. "I know, but I need to see her one last time. Not because of her, but because of me. I need to close this door forever. If I don't go, it'll stay cracked open for the rest of my life, and I'll keep asking questions that only Tanya can answer." Bryce searched Melody's eyes for hesitation, for weakness, for any sign she wasn't ready. He didn't find it. He saw only the calm of someone who'd walked through hell and wasn't afraid of fire anymore. The federal women's prison sat on the outskirts of the city, a block of gray concrete with no windows, wrapped in barbed wire and security cameras. The visitation room was cramped. A thick sheet of bulletproof glass divided the 2 sides. Beneath it was a narrow opening, just wide enough to carry sound, not wide enough to carry warmth. Melody sat down on the plastic chair, hands resting on her lap, back straight, face composed. She waited. The door on the other side of the glass opened. Tanya walked in, and Melody almost didn't recognize her. No red dress, no gold gown, no jeweled silhouettes, only a wrinkled orange prison uniform, hanging loose on a body that had clearly grown thinner. No makeup, skin pale under the fluorescent lights, dark bruises of exhaustion beneath her eyes. Hair that once shone like a shampoo advertisement now looked brittle, tied carelessly with a rubber band. But her eyes hadn't changed. Still burning, still hateful, still the eyes of someone locked in a cage who refused to admit she'd lost. Tanya sat down, looked at Melody through the glass, and formed a cold, crooked smile. "Well, look who it is. Cinderella coming to visit the witch? Pretty dress, new necklace, looking like quite the lady now. Who would guess that under all that paint you're still the little girl who scrubs floors?" Melody didn't flinch. She didn't frown. Her expression didn't change. She looked at Tanya with eyes that only weeks ago had been full of fear, but now held the deep calm of someone who had accepted everything and stepped beyond it. "Why?" Tanya? Melody asked softly, not accusing, not angry, only truly trying to understand. We share blood. We share the Whitfield name. We should have been sisters. The smile fell off Tanya's face and was replaced by pure contempt. The kind of contempt so rooted in bone and marrow that even a prison uniform couldn't wash it away. Sisters? You, my sister? Tanya sneered, and the sound of it tasted bitter. You're a servant's child. I'm nobility. My father always hated your father. You know why? Because Preston was Harriet's favorite. Handsome, brilliant, loved, spoiled. And my father was treated like a shadow. When I found out you existed, when I discovered Preston left behind an illegitimate daughter, I knew that if Harriet ever found you, I'd lose everything. The inheritance, the money, the house. It would all flow to the housekeeper's girl carrying the favorite son's blood. So you made me scrub your floors, Melody said, not as a question, but as a fact, while you knew exactly who I was. And you should thank me. Tanya tilted her head, her voice hissing through the gap below the glass, that I gave you a job instead of making you disappear from the start. I thought about it, many times, but watching you on your knees every day, watching you bow your head and call me ma'am without knowing you were kneeling in front of your own cousin, that was sweeter than any pleasure in the world. A heavy silence fell between the two women, separated by a single pane of glass and yet a whole universe apart. Melody drew in a slow breath, then spoke, her voice steady, not shaking, not sharp, calm as still water. Bryce loves me when I have nothing, Tanya, when all I had was a torn uniform and calloused hands. He loves me because I know how to love. And you, even if you had all the money in the world, even if you owned the most expensive dresses, the biggest diamonds, you'd still never fill the black hole in your soul. Tanya jolted, just for a moment, as if Melody's words had touched a wound she'd hidden deepest. But she covered it immediately with familiar armor. He'll get tired of you, Tanya spat through her teeth. You're bland, you're boring. Soon he'll find someone else, someone with more class, and you'll be back holding a broom. Melody looked at Tanya one last time, long and steady, looked into those eyes blazing with hatred, and she didn't see a monster anymore. She saw a lonely, wounded woman who had chosen the wrong way to face her pain, and who was now sitting in a prison visitation room paying for those choices. Melody stood, slowly, gently, like rising from a long dream. God will forgive you, Tanya, Melody said, her voice soft but carrying. Because I already have. I'm not taking hatred out of this place with me. That part, you can keep. Keep it inside these four walls. Melody turned and walked away. Behind her, Tanya's sound flared up like the last flame of a dying fire, fists pounding the bulletproof glass. Pounding, pounding, pounding. A scream ripping through her throat and coming through the narrow gap. Come back here. I hate you. I hate you. Do you hear me? Come back. Melody didn't look back. She walked through the hallway, through the steel doors, through the processing room, and pushed the final door open. Sunlight poured in, warm and bright, and this time she didn't squint. She didn't lift a hand to shield her eyes. She stepped straight into the light, as if stepping into the new life she deserved to live. Bryce stood beside the car, in the same posture as the day he'd picked her up from the police station. But this time, there were no dark glasses, no tight, guarded expression, only the gentle worry in the eyes of a man in love. Are you okay? Melody took a deep breath. The first breath of someone who'd finally set down the weight she'd carried for 27 years. Then she smiled, and that smile shone brighter than any diamond Tanya had ever worn. I'm okay. Now I'm truly free. 1 year later, 12 months since that fateful night, and if you stepped into the back garden of the Harrington mansion today, you wouldn't recognize it as the same place where glasses once shattered, a gun once fired, and lies once piled as high as mountains. The garden has changed. There are no longer perfectly trimmed, icy hedges, no longer that lush green lawn no one was allowed to step on, no longer the soulless extravagance of a space built only to be displayed. Now there are toys scattered across the grass, a baby stroller parked by the porch, a few pots of flowers Martha planted blooming in bright colors, and above all, there is laughter, children's laughter. 2 twin boys, Keith Jr. and Preston, now a year old, have learned to walk, and they're wobbling and running all over the garden on tiny, unsteady legs, falling down, pushing themselves back up and laughing with pure delight. Chasing them is Harriet Whitfield in her electric wheelchair, pressing the accelerator and zipping along, shouting, "Stop! Stop for your grandmother," while laughing so hard she can barely catch her breath. Her elderly eyes lit with a kind of light she thought she'd lost forever over the past 27 years. The light of family. On a wicker chair beneath the maple tree, Melody's grandmother sits quietly, hands hardened by a lifetime of labor resting on her lap, eyes following her great-grandsons as they play, and she cries, not from sadness, from happiness. She has left her small house in the countryside to live with her granddaughter, and every morning she wakes up in a spacious room full of sunlight. She still has to pinch herself to believe it isn't a dream. Today is the wedding day. Not a wedding in a sealed 5-star hotel ballroom with a guest list filtered by bank accounts. A garden wedding, under the sun, beneath a blue sky, where the wind carries the scent of flowers and birdsong instead of an expensive symphony. Guests sit on rows of white wooden chairs arranged on both sides of an aisle strewn with petals, and it is the most beautiful picture anyone could imagine, because on the left are businessmen and politicians, the most powerful faces in New York in suits and evening gowns, and on the right are neighbors from Melody's hometown, silver-haired women in the finest outfits they own, men awkwardly wearing ties for the first time in their lives, and seated in the place of honor. The very first row nearest the ceremony are Martha, Vincent, Ray, and all the Harrington household staff, the people Bryce said, their family. They sit in the front. Melody appears at the end of the aisle, and the entire garden holds its breath. She wears a white handmade lace dress, not a designer piece from Paris or Milan, but a gown sewn by hand over 3 months by an elderly seamstress from her grandmother's town, every stitch carrying the love of someone who has known Melody since she was a child. Her hair falls naturally with fresh flowers tucked in, no crown, no diamonds, and she is so beautiful that even the society guests who have seen hundreds of lavish weddings can't help but whisper in awe. Harriet rolls her wheelchair to Melody's side, takes her granddaughter's hand, and the two of them move down the flower-lined aisle together. Harriet seated in her chair, gripping Melody's hand tightly, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks, while her smile shines brighter than anyone else's in the garden. She leads her granddaughter into the ceremony. She leads the granddaughter she believed she had lost for 27 years, to the man who will love her for the rest of her life, and it is the greatest pride of Harriet's 82 years. Bryce stands at the altar in a 3-piece black suit, sharp and powerful, but his hands are trembling. For the first time in his life, the Harrington boss trembles, not from danger, not from facing an enemy, but from happiness, from seeing Melody walk toward him in the sunlight, from knowing the woman who once curled up in the trunk of his car with 2 newborn babies is now coming to stand beside him as his wife. The pastor begins, and when it is time for vows, Bryce takes Melody's hands, looks into her eyes, and speaks in a low voice that trembles slightly, a tremble he doesn't bother to hide. "A year ago, I found you in the darkness of my trunk. You were terrified, filthy, desperate. But even then, you were shining, with courage, with love for 2 babies who weren't yours, yet you loved them as if they were. You taught me that true nobility isn't in a name, and it isn't in a bank account, it's in the heart. I love you not because you're the Whitfield heir. I love you because you've always been Melody. Brave Melody, honest Melody, my Melody." Melody bites her lip, tears falling while her smile stays alive. And when it is her turn, her voice is small, but it carries through the garden's absolute silence. "You were the only one who saw me when I was invisible. When the whole world turned away, you stepped closer. When I lost everything, you gave me a home, a family, and the dignity I thought had been taken from me forever. I promise I'll be your partner, the mother of our children, the 2 we already have, and the one on the way." Melody says the last words softly, but they fall into the garden's silence like a bomb. Bryce blinks, then he blinks again. Then his eyes go wide, wider and wider, until Melody breaks into laughter. "What?" Melody laughs, radiant, one hand holding Bryce's, the other resting on her belly in a gentle touch. "Yes, my love, we're going to have another baby." The garden erupts. Cheers, shouting, applause rolling like thunder. Harriet throws both hands up to the sky, murmuring words of gratitude. Melody's grandmother covers her face and sobs against Martha's shoulder. The society guests rise and clap, the hometown neighbors whistle, and the twin boys, not understanding what is happening, run in circles up and down the petal-strewn aisle, laughing. Bryce doesn't wait for the pastor to say, "You may kiss the bride." He steps forward, wraps both arms around Melody's waist, lifts her up, and spins her. One turn, then another, her white dress flying in the sunlight, and he kisses her in the middle of laughter and tears, beneath a blue sky and blazing flowers. When he sets her down, the two boys race in, wrap their arms around their parents' legs, and Bryce opens his arms wide, pulling Melody and the children against him. 4 people, 1 family. Perfect. The celebration lasts until morning. There is live music, a band that plays everything from jazz to country, champagne flowing and cold lemonade, Wagyu steak, and also the cornbread Melody's grandmother baked from a family recipe. Rich and poor sit at the same tables, clink glasses, dance, tell stories, and laugh. No one asks what anyone is wearing, what they drive, where they live. There is only music, laughter, and the warmth of people who chose love instead of hatred. And that, dear friends, is the story of Bryce Harrington and Melody Reeves, a story that began in the darkness of a car trunk and ends beneath the sunshine of a garden in bloom, a story that teaches us that monsters can wear silk, diamonds, and a perfect smile. Angels can wear a cleaning uniform, calloused hands, and not a penny to their name. That true love doesn't read a financial statement before it knocks on your heart. That courage isn't measured by muscles or power, but by whether you dare to stand up for what is right when the whole world tells you to sit down. And that sometimes justice arrives late, but it still arrives. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button so we know you were here, you listened, and you felt it. Please share this story with someone you love, someone who needs to believe that justice still exists and love still wins. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss new compelling stories every day. We would truly love to hear what you think. How did this story feel to you? Have you ever met people like Melody in real life, quietly enduring but never losing their kindness? Or have you ever witnessed people like Tanya, wearing a perfect mask while hollow and cruel inside? Please leave a comment and share your thoughts, because every comment you write is motivation for us to keep bringing stories that reach deep into the heart. We read every comment and we cherish every word you share. Finally, we wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace, and days filled with happiness and calm. Thank you for being with us. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.